On the night of the 24th of April 2007, the sky above the Mexico-United States border transformed into a monster of wind and fury. What began as an isolated storm in Mexico transformed, in a matter of minutes, into a tornado of relentless force. Its roar crossed the Rio Grande, leaving in its wake a scene of destruction that forever marked two communities united by tragedy: Piedras, Negras, and Eagle Pass. Houses were ripped from their foundations, families were trapped beneath the rubble, and the world discovered, once again, that nature knows no boundaries. That night, the wind wrote a story of pain, but also of resilience, whose traces still linger in the memories of those who survived. The birth of the storm, the 24th of April 2007, didn't start out as an exceptional day in the US-Mexico border region. For most residents, it was a warm, humid, and seemingly routine day, like so many others in spring. But high in the atmosphere, invisible pieces were aligning that, when put together, would give rise to one of the most memorable storms of that decade. The northern border of Mexico and southern Texas constitute a terrain particularly vulnerable to the fury of nature. At first glance, it is a region dominated by open plains, interrupted by rivers and small human settlements. But for meteorologists, it is a setting ripe for the development of violent phenomena. Warm, humid air from the Gulf of Mexico rises unhindered over these plains. At the same time, cold air masses descend from the Rocky Mountains and the Mexican Plateau. In the interface between the two systems, temperature and pressure contrasts occur that are sometimes capable of creating truly monstrous atmospheric phenomena. That was exactly what happened that day. During the afternoon, weather radars detected the emergence of a supercell in Mexico. A supercell is no ordinary storm. It is the elite of convective systems, capable of producing hail the size of baseballs, torrential rains, and, under extreme conditions, devastating tornadoes. Its main characteristic is the presence of a mesocyclone, an organized rotation within the cloud, fueled by updrafts and downdrafts that interact in a complex manner. The atmosphere combined the three classic ingredients of atmospheric instability: abundant moisture, intense heat, and a strong shift in upper air winds. On pressure maps, meteorologists could see how the lower layers were pulling warm air from the Gulf, while at higher levels, cold, dry winds from the west predominated. The difference in direction and speed between these currents created what is known as wind shear. This shear causes an updraft, rather than dissipating, to begin to rotate and keep the storm alive for hours. By early afternoon, the supercell already had a perfectly defined anvil, extending over the horizon like an ominous omen. Lightning flashes lit up the sky in broad daylight, and irregular formations suggesting rotation could be seen at the base of the cloud. It was a prelude to something bigger. Meanwhile, in the border communities, no one imagined what was about to happen. In Piedras Negras, life went on as usual. Children played in the streets, businesses were open as usual, and although some residents noticed the heaviness of the air and the growing darkness in the sky, no one imagined that this storm would become a historic phenomenon. In Texas, across the Rio Grande, meteorological authorities from the National Weather Service were already closely monitoring the system. Models indicated conditions were ripe for tornadoes, but as is so often the case in the region, it was difficult to pinpoint where or when the first one would form. Experience had shown that the border, although prone to severe storms, was rarely the scene of major tornadoes. This perception of relative safety played a decisive role in the surprise that would follow. As the afternoon progressed, the supercell mesocyclone intensified. Doppler radar began to record more organized rotation. Warm air currents rose violently, reaching heights of more than 10 kilometers, while the rotation became increasingly defined. Everything indicated that the storm could spawn a tornado at any moment. The formation of a tornado is as fascinating as it is terrifying. In the lower layers, warm, moist air rises rapidly, while at higher altitudes, a cold air current pushes it laterally. This collision generates an invisible cylinder of horizontal rotation, like a roller of air spinning parallel to the ground. When the updraft manages to tilt this cylinder and make it vertical, the storm begins to spin. This is the point at which the mesocyclone can give rise to a downward funnel. In Piedras Negras, toward the end of the afternoon, the first signs of disaster began to become visible. A low, dark, rotating cloud slowly descended from the base of the storm. Some witnesses later recalled how the sky took on a greenish hue, a strange color that often precedes the most violent storms. Within minutes, the funnel touched down. What until that moment was only a threat became a full-blown tornado, spinning with a force that would soon be classified as EF3 on the enhanced Fujita scale. That means winds of more than 250 kilometers per hour, capable of tearing off roofs, knocking down walls, and tossing vehicles around like toys. That was the birth of the tornado that would forever change the memory of two sister cities. The phenomenon quickly gained strength, fueled by the thermal energy accumulated during the day. The supercell, like a hungry beast, absorbed heat and moisture from the ground, keeping the rotation alive and allowing the funnel to expand. Lightning struck with unusual frequency, illuminating the tornado cone in brief, spectral flashes. Meteorologists in Texas watched the radar images in amazement. The rotation was intense, with a hook-shaped echo that made clear what was happening. They knew that, after hitting Piedras Negras, the tornado would continue north, crossing the river and endangering communities on the American side. But at that moment, the focus of the tragedy was in Mexico, and Villa de Fuente, a densely populated area of Piedras Negras, was right in the beast's path. The birth of the storm was not just a meteorological phenomenon. It was the starting point of a chain of events that would unite two nations under a common pall of grief. The fury in Piedras Negras, the tornado was born. A dark, dense, and swirling funnel descended from the base of the storm with the precision of a natural guillotine. In a matter of seconds, the peaceful routine of Piedras Negras turned into a living nightmare. The town of Fuente, a community of narrow streets and humble homes, was right in the path of the beast. What seemed impossible materialized with a deafening roar, a cone of wind, earth, and debris advancing with relentless fury. The sound was the first thing many remembered. Those who survived described it as like the roar of 1,000 trains passing at once. A deep, continuous roar that made the ground vibrate beneath their feet. The sky, tinged with green and gray, seemed to crush down on the city. Some residents ran for shelter in their homes. Others sought basements or interior rooms. But many didn't have time. The tornado was there, moving swiftly, tearing up everything in its path. The houses in Villa de Fuente, mostly built with concrete blocks or brick, were ill-equipped to withstand winds of more than 250 kilometers per hour. Roofs tore off like dry leaves, walls collapsed, and what had once been a home, a space filled with life and memories, became a mountain of rubble. On the main avenue, a school bus was lifted off the ground and thrown against a fence. On the streets, cars twirled in the air like toys in the hands of an invisible giant. The power of the wind was so brutal that it uprooted trees and bent metal poles like rebar. The scenes from that moment are etched in the collective memory. Maria de Los Angeles, a resident of the area, told a local media outlet years later how she heard a strange noise, went out to her yard, and saw a swirling black cloud approaching rapidly. She barely had time to gather her children and take shelter in an interior hallway when the roof collapsed. She survived, but when she went outside, she discovered her entire street had disappeared. The hospitals in Piedras Negras began to fill up within minutes. People with fractures, deep cuts, bruises, and injuries caused by objects thrown like projectiles arrived en masse. The local health system, unprepared for a disaster of this magnitude, was quickly overwhelmed. Doctors worked tirelessly, treating those they could and referring others to neighboring cities. The human toll was tragic. 3 people died that afternoon in Piedras Negras, and dozens were injured. 3 lives may seem few compared to the magnitude of the material destruction, but each one represented a family shattered, a loss impossible to fill. Official figures later reflected the magnitude of the disaster. More than 600 homes were severely damaged, and more than 200 were completely destroyed. In a matter of minutes, hundreds of families were left homeless. The wind not only blew away walls and roofs, it also swept away belongings, memories, and life plans. Local authorities faced a colossal challenge. Amid the chaos, communications were precarious. The storm had damaged power lines and left entire neighborhoods without electricity. The drinking water supply was disrupted in several neighborhoods. Rescuers, supported by volunteers and neighbors, began scouring the streets for survivors. Amid the rubble, hope and despair intertwined. Each cry for help was followed by the heroic efforts of hands removing stones and planks, attempting to rescue those trapped. One of the most memorable cases was that of a mother who, protected under a mattress, managed to save her two young children. When rescuers arrived, they found them unharmed, although surrounded by debris from their collapsed home. Such scenes became symbols of resilience in the midst of tragedy. The psychological impact was also profound. For many residents of Piedras Negras, that tornado was the first they had ever witnessed. Mexico, unlike the United States, doesn't have such an extensive history of devastating tornadoes, and community preparedness was limited. Warning systems didn't work effectively, and the population had no clear protocols for what to do in an emergency. The result was a widespread state of shock, fear, and confusion. The Villa de Fuente was unrecognizable. Aerial images showed a path of destruction that cut through the community like a scar. It was the characteristic trail of a strong tornado, a strip of land where everything had been leveled, surrounded by areas where little damage was visible. This selective destruction, one house reduced to rubble next to another that had lost only a few tiles, bewildered many, but it is part of the chaotic nature of these phenomena. In the hours that followed, state and federal authorities descended on the area. Emergencies were declared, temporary shelters were set up, and cleanup efforts began. However, the grief of those who had lost everything could not be quickly assuaged. Piedras Negras mourned its dead, cared for its wounded, and faced the reality that its community had changed forever. What few knew at the time was that the tragedy was not yet over. The tornado, fueled by the energy of the supercell, did not dissipate after devastating Piedras Negras. It continued its inexorable march northward, and in its path lay another city that would suffer its fury even more brutally: Eagle Pass, Texas. But before crossing the Rio Grande, the lesson was already written on Mexican soil. Piedras Negras had revealed human fragility in the face of the power of nature, and had left an indelible testimony of pain and survival. The Rio Grande crossing and the devastation at Eagle Pass. The tornado knew no boundaries. After devastating the Villa de Fuente in Piedras Negras, the supercell that fueled it remained alive, powerful, spinning overhead like a colossal cogwheel of clouds and lightning. The Rio Grande, the dividing line between Mexico and the United States, was no obstacle to that column of wind and fury. As if cast by a cursed shadow, the funnel crossed the riverbed in a matter of minutes, heading toward a new target: Eagle Pass, Texas. As evening fell, the Texas community began to feel the first signs of disaster. The sky turned a deep gray, with flashes of green and purple illuminating the clouds. Many residents, accustomed to the region's thunderstorms, watched with concern, but not fear. Most were unaware that a high-intensity tornado was approaching at high speed. The National Weather Service had issued warnings, but not all homes had emergency radios or televisions turned on to receive them. Within minutes, sirens began wailing in some areas, but by then the funnel was already visible from the outskirts of the city. The first area to be hit was Rosita Valley, a densely populated area of manufactured homes and schools. Powerful tornadoes are often merciless with such lightweight construction, and this one was no exception. In seconds, entire walls were blown away like sheets of paper, and entire roofs were lifted off their foundations. What had been a vibrant neighborhood of families became a field of debris. One of the most dramatic scenes occurred at a nearby school. Although the building was empty at the time, the structure suffered severe damage. The roof was partially torn off, and several classrooms were destroyed. For parents, the sight of what could have been an even greater tragedy remained etched in their memories. Had the tornado struck a few hours earlier, the catastrophe would have claimed dozens of children's lives. But not everyone was so fortunate. In Eagle Pass, 7 people died that afternoon, direct victims of the tornado. Some died in their manufactured homes. Others were trapped under collapsed walls. Among them was an entire family that didn't manage to escape in time. For the community, the blow was devastating. 7 empty chairs at family dinners. 7 stories cut short by the indomitable force of the wind. The city's hospitals received an avalanche of injured people. People with broken bones, trauma, and cuts caused by debris filled the emergency rooms. Medical staff worked tirelessly, while volunteers and neighbors donated blood, brought water, and provided whatever support they could. It was a collective effort in the face of a shared tragedy. The tornado's power was clearly evident in the scale of the destruction. Cars were thrown dozens of feet, concrete poles were snapped like dry branches, and ancient trees collapsed as if made of cardboard. From the air, the sky was clear, a swathe of destruction that cut across southern Eagle Pass, delineating the devastated areas with surgical precision. Meteorologists who subsequently analyzed the phenomenon concluded that the tornado had maintained a category EF3 on the enhanced Fujita scale as it crossed the border. This meant winds could exceed 250 kilometers per hour. At that speed, an object as common as a wooden board becomes a lethal projectile, capable of penetrating walls and endangering the lives of anyone not sheltered. Survivors described apocalyptic scenes. One witness, interviewed by the local press, recounted how he saw the funnel approaching while trying to protect his family. It was a black monster, spinning, and everything it touched was ripped from the ground. You felt the earth itself tremble beneath your feet. Another neighbor recalled emerging from the rubble of his home and finding a deathly silence interrupted only by cries for help and the creaking of collapsed structures. The disaster immediately mobilized Texas rescue teams. The National Guard was deployed in the following hours, and the state governor declared a state of emergency in the region. Specialized teams arrived to assess damage and assist with rescue efforts. Helicopters circled the affected areas searching for trapped people, and trained dogs combed the rubble to locate survivors. Community solidarity was another key factor. Neighbors who had lost little or nothing rallied to help those who had lost everything. Makeshift shelters were set up in churches and gymnasiums, where hundreds of families found temporary refuge. Donations of clothing, food, and water arrived from nearby cities. Eagle Pass, struck by tragedy, also showed the shining face of human empathy. However, the pain was impossible to hide. The victims' funerals became community gatherings filled with tears and silence. Each name read aloud was an open wound in the heart of the city. And while the material damage could be measured in numbers, the loss of human life was incalculable. Subsequent analysis revealed that the warning system had partially worked, but a lack of community preparedness played a crucial role in the magnitude of the disaster. Many families lacked safe shelters, and lightweight construction proved to be death traps. The Eagle Pass tragedy highlighted the vulnerability of entire communities to events of this magnitude, and the need to strengthen preventive measures on both sides of the border. The crossing of the Rio Grande had been more than just a physical displacement of the tornado. It was a brutal reminder that natural disasters ignore political maps or human boundaries. Mexico and the United States, two nations separated by laws and borders, shared the same misfortune that night under the same sky. When the storm finally dissipated, it left behind a scene reminiscent of something out of a disaster movie. Entire neighborhoods destroyed, families displaced, lives cut short. But it also left a question echoing in everyone's mind. Were they truly prepared to face nature's fury? The answer, at least that night, was painfully clear. Traces of destruction and forgotten lessons. When the sky finally calmed and the tornado's roar died away, what remained was a thick silence, a strange emptiness that seemed impossible to fill. That silence wasn't peace. It was the bated breath of a city awakening to the magnitude of the tragedy. In both Piedras Negras and Eagle Pass, the next day's dawn revealed a reality that seemed like something out of a nightmare. From the air, the scar was visible. A swath of destruction crisscrossed entire neighborhoods, leaving behind a patchwork of homes ripped from their foundations, toppled trees, and unrecognizable streets. In Piedras Negras, the village of Fuente was now a labyrinth of ruins, where each family walked in disbelief amid the remnants of their former lives. Similar scenes were seen in Eagle Pass, Rosita Valley, and the surrounding areas. Entire blocks of prefabricated housing reduced to splinters. Official figures offered a concrete dimension of the disaster. In Piedras Negras, more than 600 homes were severely damaged, and more than 200 were reduced to total rubble. In Eagle Pass, the figure was equally alarming. Hundreds of homes destroyed, businesses collapsed, schools unusable. But the cold statistics did not reflect the true weight of the tragedy. Each number represented a family. Each lost home was a space laden with memories erased by the force of the wind. Personal stories began to emerge from the rubble. An Eagle Pass man recounted how, after hearing the siren, He barely had time to cover his children under a mattress before the roof disintegrated above them. I felt the wind tear my daughter from my arms, and all I could do was hold her tighter, he told a local newspaper. All three survived, but the image of the tornado tearing through his street would haunt him for years. In Piedras Negras, a woman recalled how she was rescued from the wreckage of her home by neighbors who dug with their bare hands. I heard the screams, but I couldn't move. The dust made it hard to breathe. I thought I was going to die there, she later recounted in a television interview. She lost her mother in the same incident. These accounts, multiplied by dozens, built a human mosaic that showed not only the violence of the phenomenon, but also the vulnerability of the communities. Many residents confessed to not knowing what to do. Without underground shelters or clear emergency plans, most simply improvised, hiding in hallways, covering themselves with mattresses, seeking out hidden corners. Some survived thanks to these quick decisions, others were not so lucky. Scenes of solidarity also became part of the collective memory. Volunteers who had lost nothing scoured the streets with lanterns and tools, searching for survivors. Churches opened their doors as makeshift shelters. Entire families donated clothing, food, and water. In Eagle Pass, a gymnasium became a shelter for more than 100 people for weeks. In Piedras Negras, neighbors shared what little they had left to support those who had lost everything. The press on both sides of the border echoed the catastrophe. Headlines spoke of a shared tragedy, the tornado that knew no borders. Local newspapers published heartbreaking images of families searching through the wreckage of their homes, while national television stations used helicopters to show the extent of the devastation. The world discovered, with astonishment, that tornadoes of this magnitude could strike even in regions where the population hadn't expected them. The subsequent technical analysis revealed serious flaws in the warning systems and urban preparedness. Although the United States Meteorological Service issued warnings in a timely manner, many families lacked the means to receive them. In Mexico, early warning systems were virtually non-existent at the time. The lack of adequate shelters, the fragility of prefabricated housing, and a poor culture of prevention combined to turn the event into a tragedy of even greater magnitude. Civil engineers who inspected the area agreed that many buildings did not meet standards capable of withstanding severe storms. In Rosita Valley, prefabricated homes were swept away almost without resistance. In Piedras Negras, concrete block homes collapsed because they lacked sufficient structural reinforcement. The catastrophe was not just a consequence of the wind, it also reflected decades of accumulated human vulnerability. Even so, reconstruction began almost immediately. Local, state, and federal governments deployed resources, and civil organizations provided logistical support. But the process was slow and painful. For many families, rebuilding a home meant starting from scratch, with the emotional burden of what was lost still fresh in their memories. Beyond the bricks and mortar, the 2007 tornado left invisible marks. Psychologists who worked with survivors reported high levels of post-traumatic stress, especially in children. Many had recurring nightmares of dark skies, sounds of wind, or heavy rain. Others, upon hearing sirens or thunder, relived the paralyzing fear of that afternoon. As the months passed, life in Piedras Negras and Eagle Pass resumed its rhythm, but with indelible scars. Families learned, painfully, that prevention was not a luxury but a necessity. Some began building makeshift shelters in their yards. Others acquired weather radios. Schools implemented emergency drills. The memory of what had happened had sown a new awareness. However, over time, as is often the case, the tragedy faded into memory. The headlines faded, outside aid dwindled, and the two cities were left to rebuild their lives alone. Many residents feared that the lessons learned would be forgotten in the grind of daily life, until another disaster would remind them of their community's vulnerability. The 2007 tornado wasn't the deadliest or largest in border history, but it did leave an unforgettable lesson. The force of the wind can erase in minutes what generations took decades to build. And if communities aren't prepared, the price is always paid in human lives. The 24th of April 2007 was etched in the memory of two sister cities united by grief. Piedras Negras and Eagle Pass, separated by the Rio Grande, experienced the same tragedy under the same sky. In a matter of minutes, the tornado erased the borders drawn on maps and reminded everyone that, in the face of nature, there are no walls or national boundaries. The wind doesn't understand languages, flags, or anthems. It only responds to the invisible laws of the atmosphere, to contrasts of heat and cold, to rising and falling currents that, when they collide, engender fury. And that fury falls equally on everyone, regardless of which side of the river they live on. What was left behind was more than material destruction. It left scars on the streets, on bodies, and, above all, on the souls of communities. Families who lost loved ones, children who learned too soon what fear meant, entire neighborhoods that understood in a single night the fragility of their foundations. But it also left a testament to resilience, the solidarity that crossed borders, the hands that joined together to rescue, the shelters that opened without asking for passports. The reflection that emerges from this tragedy is clear. No community is completely safe. Preparedness saves lives. Safe shelters, reliable warning systems, preventive education in schools and families, all of these can make the difference between life and death. The 2007 tornado starkly demonstrated what happens when these measures are lacking. Today, looking back, we remember that 3 lives were lost in Piedras, Negras, and 7 in Eagle Pass. 10 people in total who didn't return home that night. 10 absences that remind us that each number is a face, a story, a void impossible to fill. In their memory, our commitment cannot be to forget, but to prevent, because nature will test our defenses again. And when it does, all we'll have left is what we've learned. The wind knows no boundaries, but we can understand that unity, preparation, and empathy are the only weapons capable of withstanding its fury. If this story shook you as much as it did us, subscribe to the Extreme Tornado channel. Here we continue exploring nature's most shocking events, because learning about them is the best way to be prepared. Don't forget to like and share this documentary, and join us on our next trip to the heart of the storm.